Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another education and outreach session organized by Jnanaprabodhini Foundation's analytics team. We are a non-profit computational social science platform engaged in research, analysis, and policy making. And for more about us, you can go on to our website, jnanaprabodhinifoundation.org/analytics. In today's session, we'll be giving you an overview and introduction to data visualization. And in previous sessions, we have talked about how data can be manipulated through simple data pipelines of how one goes from scraping and cleaning the data to transforming it to doing the actual data analysis and finally to visualizing it. And we've talked about some of these other points in the pipeline in some of our previous sections, which you can check out on our YouTube channel. The key thing to emphasize here is that data alone is meaning and useless. It needs to be transformed and value needs to be added to it before it can actually be useful in the real world. For example, we've talked about how, just like in another completely different domain, a farmer grows wheat and how that wheat is processed into flour, which is turned into bread, which is eventually sent to stores and restaurants, which use that bread to make sandwiches, which eventually reach you, the consumer. And similar to how these chains in economics of how the raw material is processed, and at each step there is some new value that is added to it. Exactly like that, we see in the context of data that how you go from raw data to refined insights, that at each step you're going from individual facts, figures, signals, and measurements and adding something more. You're transforming that data to information, to knowledge, to wisdom, and you're synthesizing the data at each step. The final part of this process often ends up being data visualization of this data analysis pipeline, where you're communicating your findings to the public, to some kind of relevant stakeholder, be it in academia, industry, the government, or any other sector. We have also talked about how this pipeline is not linear. This is just a convenient visualization of it. But in fact, that you might go back and iterate at each part of this process. However, today we will be restricting our focus to data visualization, the last part of this pipeline, so to speak. And we are going to talk about how data visualization has two purposes. So the first, which we will not really focus on during this session, is how data visualization is often useful for exploring data. However, this sort of data visualization is often self-centric, as in you, the user, the data analyst, are doing it for your own sake, for you to understand and eventually analyze the data better. However, the part that we will be focusing on, the type of data visualization we will be stressing on in this session, is about how we can communicate data. So this is a very other-centric view of data, how you're communicating a story from the data. You're really focusing on others in this process, and that might be your reader, in a business setting, your client, whatever, but it's not you who's important. And why this is important to keep in mind is because whenever you're creating a new data visualization, you need to have, you need to know the goals. That is, what is this for? And you need to know your audience. Who is this data visualization for? Knowing the answers to these questions can help you, calibrate the kind of visualization that you're creating. And if you think about it as a spectrum, from yourself on the left, which is the visualizer, to your audience or the viewer on the right. There's different steps that go from, what do I see in the purple, that when you're perceiving the data as the creator, your graph or your image as the visualizer, to thinking about that middle role, as in, like, when someone sees this immediately, what does it mean for, like, that subject? How would they interpret it? To finally taking, like, a very viewer-centric, user-centric approach, as in, like, how might they comprehend that data? And we'll make these things, like, clear as we go along in this session. But yeah, so we'll be more focused, as I mentioned, on data visualization for communicating data. So the purpose is going to be a more general audience. And we are really drawing a lot of our slides, a lot of this content from Dr. Cedric Scherer's slides, or his presentation called Engaging Visualization Design to Successfully Communicate Data. And he has the slides available on his own website. He's a professional data visualizer, by the way. And he goes into this in a lot more detail. He also covers some other points. He does not cover some points that we'll be trying to cover here. But yeah, that is a resource that we'll be giving to you. So check it out in the description of this video. But just to, get our definitions clear and, to be very obvious about it, let's begin with, a simple question. What is data visualization? Simple definitions of it. And two, like, just very simple points about it, like, just to give a working definition, is it's any graphical representation of information and data. It's as simple as that. No need to complicate it. But as we were saying, right, it's important to remember what the purpose of it is. So why? So when you're thinking about data visualization, you can think of anything that, helps amplify our cognition, gain insights, discover, explain, and make decisions. So so we'll keep these 2 points in mind as we take a look at some of the examples that were coming ahead. And at the outset, I think we should, acknowledge the elephant in the room and say that, definitely some data visualizations are bad. They're terrible. And this is just, an assortment of bad data visualizations. And we'll talk about why they're bad in a second. But maybe intuitively, you might already be coming up with some reasons why they're bad, why they're not really good visualizations. And it's more difficult to say what makes a good visualization, but it is more objective or less ambiguous to say that, this is definitely a bad data visualization. And, by bad, we would simply mean, like, this is not a kind of visualization you would want to put in an academic paper. You might want to put in a presentation in front of your business clients meeting, or if you're in a government setting, you would not want to use these types. So to sort of explain what's bad about them, let's, go to a good visualization. So let's take an example of this. And I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about it, and you can pause this video. What do you think makes this a good visualization? Pause the video, think about it. And now that you have had a chance to think about what makes this a good data visualization, let's get into some of those points. So most importantly, right, the meat of the matter, what data is being conveyed. So there's a very clear trend of some kind of pattern that's going on. Something rises, something falls, and over time. And in this case, it is sea ice levels, right? The amount of area in the Arctic covered by ice. So most importantly, the title, what's being conveyed, it's clearly there at the top right by itself in bolded. There's very few cases where there's been bold words being used in this graph. So the title is very clear. So even before you go to the visualization, the textual aspect of it, and text also make an important part in the visualization, as we'll come to see. That title is there. Okay, in visualization, typically it's a picture, there are colors. So let's look at what we have, right? So we have a graph with two axes over here. Immediately, it's nice that the x and the y axes are pretty clear. Let's look at the x-axis to begin with. One very good thing about this is that not only is it pretty clear that you're going from, you're presenting months, you're going from January to December. One important caveat that they've given is winter is in January and February, and summer is between June, July, and August. Different regions of the world have summers at different times. I mean, the starkest example of how Northern Hemisphere people neglect summers is that this difference is that it's completely flipped, right? In places like Australia or Latin America, South Africa. So clearly labeled. So that's a good thing of the data visualization of the axis. Another good thing, so this was about the x-axis. If you look at the y-axis as well, yes, it's size in square kilometers. We're talking about the size of the ice caps, but and notice they've not given arbitrary decimal points. They've just kept it to whole numbers. So reducing the clutter. And they've given nice labels, right? They've given labels of real world countries, real world benchmarks that helps give the reader some context. 80 million square kilometers might not mean anything real for a general reader, but the size of Canada, the size of Alaska, the size of California, for someone in the United States, and this is an illustration from the New York Times. So that helps them give context. Of the actual visualization itself, of course, they've not used too many colors. The only color, in a sense, they've used is in the lines is that green-blue color, fitting for the color of ice. They have not they've blurred away, almost de-emphasized all of the other years in gray. So they've only used this green color for particular years, the most recent ones. And they highlight it, you see around September where it goes to the lowest point, how that's when the Arctic ice reached the lowest point on record. But they've given that dotted line again, which is important to just show the average. So you can easily compare above and below average. And the other bold thing that they've given is ice of that particular year. So you can see that in black. So they've kept their color palette pretty minimalist. They've not cluttered it too much, and they've given pretty important labels for context. Like in the gray ones, they've only given the earliest point from this when this was measured. So back in the 80s or so. So many points about this, which make it a good visualization, which we touched upon, and these were some informal points or informal tips. But we can see how we can make data visualization more systematic, think about it more from the point of view of a science, like what you can do. But this just gives a good starting point that what are some of the replicable, adoptable sort of best practice principles that we could use, that we see in this visualization and can be widely adopted to other purposes. To summarize though, sort of going a bit big picture again, there are 4 things in a sense that made this a good visualization, from more concrete to more abstract. So the most important point is information and integrity, right? They showed all of their data. They showed the average, but they showed all of the individual year lines. They showed the most important ones. They didn't hide any of the data. They went beyond averages to show all of the individual variation. So that was a good point. The information is clearly presented, and that's arguably one of the most important things, that you should be honest about what information is being presented. But going a step beyond, now you go into the story, right? What made this a bit more interesting, how they're conveying how this has changed over time, changed over the years, and that started leading to, what labels they decided to give. So if they wanted to emphasize more recent years, even though this data was from across about 35 odd years, they wanted to emphasize the more recent years, which is why they chose to highlight those aspects. So they're making it interesting. They're telling a story. The goal is that then finally go a step above. Like the goal, it has to be useful. Sure, it's interesting. Sure, it's conveyed everything truthfully. But if it does not convey, like serve its purpose, then it's of no use at all. And if this was in a New York Times article, it was probably to educate the public, to highlight the starkness of this issue. So the goal was to make this problem as widely understandable as possible. So maybe you might have thought this was a very simple graph, but yes, if you want to communicate to a large audience, if you're, say, a content creator, you do need to have you think about what goal you're trying to serve. Like maybe if you were presenting the same graph to climate change policy folks who might be in the government or nonprofits, it might be different. If you're doing a PhD in climatology, you're talking to scientists, climate change scientists and researchers, you might use a different one. So you really want to think about what the goal was, and does it suit the specific goal you're trying that you've identified, that piece of data visualization, what it's meant to be. And the final part is, the most subjective in a sense, that makes this more of an art than a science, is visual form and beauty. We'll not say too much about that here, but we'll touch upon some small points as we go along. Like one thing which we'll easily say, right, that, I mean, they could have used another color like orange or red, but they use like a bluish color for eyes, right? So that's just a very natural, beautiful thing which you can do, giving that real world conveying. And we'll see a couple of another examples like that. Okay, so taking a step back from this particular example, one other thing which we should think about, which about data, which you already might know, keeping in the back of your mind, is that it is very easy to lie with data. People do it all the time. Be it your intention, you might have good intentions, bad intentions, you might do it intentionally, unintentionally, but it's possible. And you might have heard this famous quote of there being lies, damn lies in statistics. And that is something to keep particularly in mind in the context of data visualizations, right? When we say a picture speaks 1,000 words, it's much easier to lie with pictures. This case, it's and that begins from the first step itself. So, our data is never a perfect reflection of the real world. So only a subset of data gets reported in many social scientific contexts. We've talked about that before in previous sessions. And there's errors associated with it, whether it's collected by humans or machines. So the data is never perfect to begin with. That's something to keep in mind just from the ground up. But then the way this data can be used to convey a particular narrative is also very interesting. And for more about that, we recommend a book called Whole Numbers and Half Truths: What Data Can and Cannot Tell Us About Modern India. That really goes into the details of how these things get reflected in an Indian context. Okay. So one example specifically, how you can lie with the data, or one of the caveats of these is that, and one of the benefits of also doing data visualization is that the statistic, the number may hide the data, but if you are visualizing it, you are showing a picture, in that case, you can show the data. So what that means here is, here in front of you, you see 4 graphs, okay? You see 4 graphs, they're different graphs, 1, 2, 3, 4. They're showing different data. But interestingly enough, the summary statistics of these data, what we mean by that is the mean, the standard deviation, that is essentially the variance, the correlation, um, are all the same in all of these. So if you took the average, that'd be the same. Variation be the same. But visually, they're very distinct. They have different trends. They just convey very different things, and that they would have meant something very different if you saw these things in the real world. So the nice one reason to do data analysis, one benefit of doing it is that it can sometimes tell us tell us more about the data, which only the numbers would probably have hidden. The numbers may have not conveyed. So that's one practical reason. Why should we do data visualizations? Because they can show the data more effectively in a more truthful manner. That is not to say that you cannot lie with the data visualizations. Data visualizations, of course, can also be misleading. And we'll take a look at a couple of misleading data visualizations. So here you have this performance, say 2 sports teams, A and B. The left is the performance on the summer, right is the performance on the winter. The A is the team which is shown in the lighter bar, B is the team shown in the darker bar. The y-axis is just the score. Pretty straightforward data visualization to understand. And in both cases, you see both in summer and winter, B has outperformed A, right? B has done better than A. B has won the matches. B has had a better performance for the season. But in which case did B really, really do better? So did it like totally outperform B, like blew it out of it was like a crushing defeat? In which case do you think that's happening? Is it in the summer or the winter? And I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about it. You can pause your video right now. Okay, now that you're back and you've had some time to think about this, you probably, if you're like most people and you're not thinking too hard about this, you might have intuitively just gone and saying, and if you're assuming it's not like a complete trick question, you might have said winter, right? Winter is where B totally outperformed A. However, what we fail to take into account, and this is why this is a trick question, is that you need to look at the y-axis. So here, if you show the y-axis, the y-axis in the left actually goes from 0 to 100. On the right, it goes from 75 to 100. And in fact, actually, the left and the right are the same. They show the same graphs where, the score of B is always 100. The score of A is always 80. And they're showing the same thing. So actually, A did no worse than B in summer or winter. Though if you show a graph like this, it can give the impression that B has done way better than A in the winter, when they actually do not. And just to drive this point in, here you can just see examples like, how if just varying the baseline, where you start your y-axis at can change the message that is being conveyed. So you can see if as you go from the left towards the right, you see very different impressions that the same data is conveying. And therefore, one general tip that we say is that bar graphs should start at 0. That's a general rule of thumb that you can use when you're doing good data visualizations. So at this point, it is worth saying, is all hope lost? That, there's lies, damn lied in statistics. Even data visualizations can communicate such misleading stories about the data. So we would like to say no, right? Not all hope is lost. There are positive things that can be done as well. And we'll give the example of someone in the spotlight, pun not intended, is Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp. She's popularly known in history. And she was known as being a British nurse, a healthcare worker who worked in the Crimean War in Ukraine in the late 19th century. But one thing we don't know that much about her is that she's not just the lady with the lamp, and if you don't know what lady with the lamp refers to, that's a whole another history to look at, where you can go and read of how she has, she, she played a huge role in nursing on the battlefield, and saved a lot of lives, right? But that's where this came together, right? Her vocation as a nurse, but her skill as a data visualization specialist, as a data scientist, should we say, where she used her passion for statistics and good, clean data visualizations to actually save lives. So let's see what she actually did. How she actually ended up doing that. So here is a graph that she actually made. And this is just the causes of mortality, the causes of deaths in the British Army, as you can see, between 1854 and 1855. And let's say you start at 12 o'clock, you start at, or rather you start at 9 o'clock, and which is April 1854, and then you go from 9 o'clock all the way down to 12 o'clock clockwise, and you end back at 9 o'clock, in March 1855. And here you can just see the amount, so the size of these, charts, these slices, they show how many deaths happened the most. So you can see down at 7 o'clock or so, that's when the most deaths occurred, in January of 1855. But the color of the slices are actually the most interesting, and they represent the cause of the deaths. Okay, the cause of the deaths. The blue wedges, which are actually the largest slice, they represent deaths from what she called preventable or mitigable diseases. That is, they're from infections that happened to the wounds, to other healthcare related issues that the soldiers were facing. The red wedges are the deaths actually from the wounds, war injuries, actually military battlefield injuries, and black are just deaths from all other causes. But the main takeaway is that most of the deaths in the war are, in this particular war, were from communicable diseases. So it was a public health even in the time of war. And this becomes, now that the coronavirus pandemic has happened, a lot of us have lived through it or have living memory of it. It's maybe a no-brainer to say that we focus on public health, but these graphs showed that even in the most dire wartime conditions, the data actually was the data was not intuitive. I mean, people were very surprised by this data at that time, to see that, oh, most of the deaths are actually going on, or can actually be attributed to diseases. So preventable diseases or preventable and mitigable, right? That you can take, that's the application of this, that if like if you took the measures, just the basic measures like having treatment and nurses and doctors and better field hospitals available. And even today, armies invest a lot on this, on field hospitals. So that just changed the way politicians and the general public looked at deaths in a war. So that's what we have Florence Nightingale to thank for her meticulous collection of the data and creation of these data visualizations. So now it's your turn. Now it's your turn to look at some more examples and see what makes them good or bad visualizations. And we can use these as activities. So in your small groups, if you're watching it by yourself, if you're doing this in class, you should discuss between yourselves what makes some of these things good examples of visualizations or bad ones, and more importantly, what can we do to improve these visualizations. So this is an example of a bad visualization that we have, a bar graph. So take a moment to pause the video and to think for yourself or discuss in groups what makes this a bad visualization and how could you improve it to make it a better visualization. I'll give you a couple of seconds. Okay, now that if you've had hopefully some time to think about it and discuss this in groups, let's jump into some of the things that you've talked about. I hope you've shared them with class. But this is an example of how you can improve this particular graph. um, I think the biggest takeaway, and many of your answers will probably fall into this category, is decluttering your charts. Be it unnecessarily include removing those unnecessary dotted fillings in the background, which is just not needed. Be it just simplifying the colors, like instead of three colors, just choose one color, because the colors are really not meaningfully different. There's not really too much data that warrants three colors. Be it simplifying the y-axis, where you probably don't need two colors again for each interval, like an interval of an odd and even multiple of 5. um, but you probably don't need to show all of them as well. All of them are actually even multiples of 10, so you can get away by just saying 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. You can ignore the 15s and 25s and 35s. And you took a huge you took away the entire box around the entire thing. You only showed the x and the y axis, which is important here. So yeah, these are just some examples, and hopefully you also came up with these. Maybe you came up with other ones which we have not, so please mention them in the comments and share them with us, of how you are, of what other flaws you saw in this graph and what you could do to improve it. Okay, so moving on to the next one. So here's two examples. So the before and after. So here we'll just give away the solution to you, of what can be done to improve it. So we've told you what to improve it. We've already talked about decluttering, but take a moment to pause, think to yourself, discuss in groups of what other changes were made apart from just simple decluttering. And we'll give a recap of what decluttering was. But in addition to decluttering, what else did they do that changed what was going on or changed the visualization? So think about it for a second or so. So you can pause the video right now. Okay, so hopefully now you have gotten a chance to discuss why the visualization on the right is better than the visualization on the left. One aspect of decluttering was that they just took away the first thing that you noticed, beyond things that we discussed in the previous example, such as getting away of all of the grid lines. That's something which was most obvious that they did. The second is cleaning up both of the axes. On the x-axis, you don't need to show the exact year at each time. You can just convey the year in the title. So that's what they did, that it's summer and fall 2019, and you can just show the actual date, right? You don't need to show everything 2019. So instead of having those tilted tilted labels, you have straight labels. That made the x-axis cleaner. You made it very explicit that you're talking about the week beginning from the 2nd of June, week beginning from the 30th, 16th of June, 30th June, so on and so forth. What about the y-axis? You added an explicit label, the average number of daily visits in thousands. And in thousands, this is another important thing which you see all the time, that humans are actually bad at dealing with largest numbers, like like beyond a few two like numbers of size 3 or 4, like as a numerical size, like the number of digits that you see. It's difficult for us to process. Who is going to keep on counting all of the zeros and all of those um, things on the y-axis? In the scientific field, you get away by using powers, right? You will use exponential notation. So you will say 2 to the power 2 times 10 to the power 5 or something. In this case, you could make it even simple, which is what they did. They just said do it in thousands, and now you have the y-axis nicely going from 0 to 300. Just easier to comprehend. Cleaned up the title, gave a little more context, right? So you can add a little byline. That's what also did. Values are calculated weekly as a 7-day average, making it very explicit. How do you get this data? And they added labels, right? They added so they got rid of the total, which was not really adding anything to the story, and they explained what was going on. They told people that there's a peak in the summer month. The only other thing that they highlighted in green in that text is the volume of out of state visitors peaks in summer months. Go down below, in-state guess has a consistent volume. So if you're only reading those two colors and our eyes immediately tend to be drawn to colors, you see out of state peaks in summer months, in state consistent volume. So these are many things that they did here, which improved, like just cleaned up the data and made it easier for your audience to comprehend what's going on. We've already talked about this before in the past two examples, but here's another example of specifically the power of labeling. And here is a paradox in data visualization. For all we say, it's a visualization. It's almost like a graphic. And we say a picture speaks 1,000 words. Text, funnily enough, paradoxically enough, can actually help a lot in visualizations. So here's an example of how of the power of annotations, so to say, the power of labels. So compare the things on the left and the right, and talk to yourself why maybe the example on the right is a better visualization, and maybe be specific to address the caveat. It sort of breaks a rule that you've learned up till now. A rule you learned up till now is declutter, right? Make everything simple. And that is a good general rule, that generally we actually put way more information than there is necessary. So it's a good strategy to reduce it to what is just enough. But here is an example where adding some information or context could help clarify what's going on better. So take some time to think about it. So pause the video, come back. Okay, I hope you got a chance to think about this. Um, Discuss amongst yourselves in your groups of why the visualization on the right is a good one. So it is a better one. It's a good visualization because it highlights key aspects of what's going on here. So many of the graphs which we've seen up till now, especially the ones which have x-axis as being time is your friend if it's on the x-axis because it helps you tell a story, right? Because you don't need to think of what story to tell. Going back to the first example of ice, right? Sea ice that we had. Going back to the example before this, where we had the number of guests over time. Time just tells you what something that's happening, especially if you have something like a period of almost over 100 years here, like you're telling a historical story. There's a clear shape which the labels helped, right? So the clear shape which the labels are pointing out of this graph is that it is there is a steady increase, there's a peak, and then there's a decline. So the first labels, it's important to say that's not any other labels that they added. They added really important labels. They added labels like the peak, the most important peak, which was in the 50s, and that was from sports. So that's how you see that the popularity of a name in general culture often is driven by key aspects of popular culture such as sports, cinema, big events that happen that impact a nation. So sports, basketball was up there. The other big event, the second highest peak, which you see in the 1960s, that's Neil Armstrong. That was a big moment, right? When Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, the first man to land on the moon. The other aspects of popular culture, again, the third one, which you see in the 70s, is musicians. Neil Young, Neil Sedaka, Neil Diamond. And they highlight beyond these top three peaks, they also highlight troughs, right? They highlight the midpoint, bottom point. So the beginning, the World War, and the end, today, modern day, present time. So um, here it's highlighting the important points of the story, almost like if you were thinking about it from a movie, like the climax scene of a movie, the highs and the lows, almost literal senses in this place. So here is a case where adding some labels gives some context here, especially if you're not from the United States or you're not that historically aware. You might not have really figured out why you're seeing the pattern that you're seeing, and this helps convey um, what is going on. And see, the title even is white space really your friend? So yes, decluttering. Clutter is generally bad, decluttering is generally good, minimalism is generally good. Sometimes adding a few labels can also help. Just to drive that point uh, we'll take another example here. Take a look at this graph. You can pause your video here. Think about what you can do to improve it. Think about what is being conveyed here. So yeah, I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about this. I'll give you 2 seconds. Okay, so I hope you got some time to think about this in your own groups, that you discuss this amongst yourselves of why this is a good sort of bad visualization and what can be done to improve it. By now you must be experts at this. All of the standard principles we've learned about decluttering your graphs, making it a bit more minimalistic, maybe removing the things that are not important. All of those things probably apply here, and you'll be right. Maybe too many colors, not too many colors. Thinking about what's you're being expected to show. By the way, this is COVID, right? I hope some of you picked up on that. That is not conveyed here, but national emergency is declared on March 13. Um, this is the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. This is all of this data. So this is basically an year change from, this is from comparing 2019 to 2020. So many of all of the standard points probably won't repeat again. One thing which they did though, which you might not have thought about, some of you might have, and kudos to you for, is that really thinking outside the box. Like sometimes it increases the point that we said about, maybe adding labels can be better sometimes. Maybe white space can be your friend sometimes. So here, maybe one graph is not enough. Maybe you need to make more graphs like these, right? And this is an improvement where he just split that first graph into many, 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 many more graphs. And that really tells you what's going on. And in fact, that allows you to actually show all of the data as well. So in fact, all of the light gray lines in these graphs you can see are the same. They're in a sense each other category that has not been highlighted. So you can see how each category stands by itself. You can see how it stands in comparison to others. You can see the change that is happening the most. So you see, and you might have also noticed in this visualization a couple of things. They are subtle, is that he has arranged them by color. So green is the thing where the spending increased the most, right? The grocery spending increased the most, and insurance increased a decent amount. Discount stores, right before the pandemic, it increased. Maybe people were aware, they stocked up, and this is right before the national emergency was declared. But then pharmacy spendings spent right up, they increase right after it. But look at things like fuel, transit, and ground transportation. They're the ones which were affected the most. And again, maybe it's obvious, right, looking back in hindsight, that it was the lockdown. So this gives us very nice historical insight. Like this should go in a history textbook, but this was produced not by historians, right? You can see the source. It is JP Morgan Chase. It's a bank. It's one of the largest banks in the world. So they're the people who will have this data, who will be interested in this data. But of course, as we compare it to the first graph that you made from this, you probably could not have told all of these individual trends. And therefore, the power of small multiples, what they say. So there's the original graphic on the left-hand side by JP Morgan Chase, and on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, you can see that makeover, where yes, maybe you're making more graphs, but maybe that's fine. Maybe sometimes increasing the number of graphs can actually help simplify the data. So it's a paradox, but it works. So that's another sort of nuanced principle that you can help keep in mind when you're making your own visualizations. Okay, we'll end with this. We've been talking for a while, but some small guidelines and things about, colors and pitfalls. Hopefully it's obvious that this current slide is a terrible slide, stolen it from Cedric Scherer. It's a bad slide. It's too much, too cluttered. Many reasons. But here is where we should emphasize that, data science is also an art. So this is one of Cedric Scherer's maps where he's visualizing the number of beekeepers in different places in Germany, and small things where you're really going the extra level, where you're obviously choosing the colors of honey, but you're even making your map look like a honeycomb. This is just next level piece of art and good piece of data visualization. Even if we can't aspire to that level, the one on the left is an example of a map, a map of the brain from the field of neuroscience. It's a map of brain activity, which parts of the brain are more active when doing a particular task. So these are just very artistic visualizations, very cool ones, which of course preserve the integrity and story, but they're just at a very high level visualization. Even if we may not be able to achieve all of these things from the get-go, there are some very basic principles we can keep in mind, such as your color palette choice. So realizing when to use sequential palettes and when to use diverging palettes is very important. So both of them are used to convey numerical information, right? Information which, when your data is in the form of numbers, it's quantitative data typically. And there is an order to the data. So in both cases, but what's the difference between them? The difference is that in the diverging one, you probably have a critical midpoint. So you have the 50% mark is probably meaningful. So below and above average, that's something probably you might be showing. Or you might be showing more or less than zero. Zero is often a very important critical midpoint. So you might be showing positive versus negative values. You might be showing less than 50%, more than 50%. So that's important from a diverging scale. In a sequential scale, that midpoint is not that important, and you want to show the contrast a bit more important. And you can go into the R package for this color space for more details about this. So just an example of how the same visualization can look different based on different color palettes, these sequential versus diverging. So here you see the percent of people who use the internet in 2015. So it's about 8-year-old graph images. And you see it's not a perfect map of the world. It's a map of the world where every country is represented as a square, and the size of the square is scaled to the population of the country. That's why you see India and China being the biggest countries. And the shade of the square is what percent of people in the world use internet. So this is how it differs on what story you're telling. On the left, you can see that, generally a decent part of the world has internet. It's mostly used in the West, but other countries have it as well. The diverging palette on the right is a bit more important or a bit more stark here, because it really conveys that critical midpoint of do more or less than half of your population use the internet. By the way, you can go and look up the statistic, what it is when you're currently watching the video. But when we recorded this or when we curated these slides in June 2023, I believe it was just over half of India that had access to internet, somewhere in the 50%, maybe low 60s. Of course, this is aggregate for India. It's much higher in rural areas. But this map from 2015 really showed how stark the inequality in internet access was in the world, in how most African and Asian countries, less than half of the population had access to internet. And that was conveyed more starkly in this case by using this diverging palette. So this is a case where a diverging palette might be more useful. Now, let's talk about another simple type of data. And this is one of the biggest problems that that you see, the most common problems. Let's say you don't have numerical data, you don't have numbers in your data, you have categories. For example, you have categories, like you have the names of people, like you see in this graph: Ivan, David, Anna, Lisa. You might have, if you're in a business setting, these might be the names of different companies, it might be the names of your clients, right? um, but here, if you want to show the distinction between them, you would want to use very stark and contrasting colors. So the palette on the left is not a good one because it implies a sequential increase in the data, right? You're going from light blue to dark blue. The human mind will intuitively think that light blue to dark blue means you're going from less to more, or at the very least, you're going from one value, you might be increasing or decreasing. We'll typically think it's increasing, but you'll think of some numerical distinction between these. That's probably not the case, which is why a palette on the right is more suitable. But and this also answers, the example at the very beginning which we gave. Why the very bad ones? That's the last sort of takeaway which they give. Limit the categories to 6 or 8. Don't choose too many colors. More than 6 to 8 colors, it's going to be very difficult for your audience to understand what's going on. It'll be too much information. People don't have that attention span. So declutter, declutter, declutter. So that's another point about these. Finally, be kind, right? Here at Jnana Prabodhini Foundation, we value serving the most deprived of our community. We are not just doing data visualization in an academic audience or a industry audience, a business audience, or even a government audience. We are often doing it in a non-profit setting where the goal of who you're communicating to might be very diverse communities, and you want to think of all of them when you're creating these visualizations. A very important aspect of that here is picking colorblind friendly palettes. So there's this nice platform called Viz Palette where you can go and see how different people with different types of color blindness will see different colors. And here it should be important to emphasize that color blindness as a whole affects almost 4 to 5% of our population. Numbers vary, but it affects a good deal of people, and there's different types of color blindness. Different genders have different susceptibility to color blindness. So I believe males are more susceptible to a particular type of color blindness. But here you'll be able to very easily see how your chosen color palette appears to someone with no color deficiency, like this current palette is, but it would also appear to someone with color deficiency. So this is how that same palette looks like to someone who does have deuteranopia, which is a particular type of color blindness. And such websites, such resources also allow you to think about what palettes that you can choose to make sure that even someone with color blindness can actually understand what you're showing. So the colors should not blur together for them. So think about now that we are putting ourselves in that habit, that mindset of thinking from the shoes of someone else, thinking from the perspective of someone else, thinking about people with color blindness in data visualization is a very practical way you can make your visualizations more inclusive to people. Okay, just to summarize, just to recap all of these things, all of these examples, what makes a good visualization? We started off by saying that It's pretty obvious that what makes a bad visualization, it's a bit subjective about what makes a good visualization. Nonetheless, there are some rules of thumb, there are some heuristics that you can adhere to that can greatly improve the data visualizations that you make. So we'll summarize with this example. So again, I'll give you a couple of seconds, a couple of minutes to think about what makes this a good data visualization. So you can pause your video and think about it. Okay, I hope you have had a chance to pause this video, think about this for yourself, discuss this in your own groups, in your small groups with your fellow students. What makes this a good visualization? And we've done this exercise of by now a few times in this session. So we'll not belabor all of the points. We'll give you the answer key. Here are just some of the points, and we will encourage you to pause the video and take a look, really take a look at all of these individual things in detail. So there is a fun and helpful title at the top, right? The title is critical. It conveys what's going on. There's description of what the axes are, what the X and the Y axis is time to do. There is a particular choice about why particular two vertical lines are there. There is a particular labeling which has been undertaken in both the x-axis and the y-axis. The labels that have been chosen to be used within, like in the actual graph, in the middle of the grid, they are chosen with some thought. So really take some time, pause this video, take a look at it, discuss among yourselves. Do you think these helped you understanding the graph? Were they necessary, not necessary? But these are some good examples of good data visualizations and why they are good visualizations. So that's all about creating good visualizations, and we'll be coming back for next time in but you please go to your own breakout rooms, to your own individual groups for more follow-up about this. We will mention some common data visualization tools here, which you can use, though the focus of this session is not how to give you hands-on instruction of creating actual visualizations, but in R and Python, there are commonly used packages such as Plotly, ggplot2, which you can go and explore if you've been using these languages. They have a lot of resources and vignettes which can help you create good data visualizations. In other fields, you don't need to necessarily know how to code, how to do good visualizations. A data wrapper is an excellent free online tool which you can use to create good visualizations. But even something as simple as Google Sheets or Microsoft Excel can create really powerful visualizations if you know how to do so. And Figma is like if you're more on the more professional end, of course Canva is there, but Figma just allows you to create very different visualization. So these are just good resources, and there are, like, go outside and learn for yourself, right? There are tutorials out there. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. You can go and find tutorials for these things and learn by yourself how to create good visualizations with these. There's a bunch of standard visualizations. So knowing what type of visualization that you're looking at, even if you don't create a good visualization, creating a data visualization literacy is important. So knowing what a bar graph is, knowing what a stacked bar graph is, knowing what a line plot is, what a pie chart is, what a stacked vertical column chart is, knowing all the types of different graphs. And this is just an example from data wrapper of the types of different graphs, by no means exhaustive. So that often helps you when you see a very good visualization. You can you immediately start thinking, oh, it's a good line plot, so let me go and look up how to create good line plot. So creating this data fluency or literacy is very important. So go read up of what different visualizations you are. If you've seen a very cool visualization by yourself, try to find out, what type of visualization is this? How can I recreate it? So that gets you to think about these things in a more systematic and a more scientific manner. So this is like a good resource about that. So if you're thinking, and this allows you to think about what are you really trying to show, right? Thinking about the goals of visualizations. So are you showing a relationship between things? So there you might go to the left, right? You might try to do a scatter plot, which is the most simple thing people often show when they're showing two numerical variables, when you're showing a correlation between them. If you're doing something at the bottom, composition, and this is something you'll often see in industry and non-profit and government context, right? Pie charts are the classic things that you'll see. A static composition, how much did what can we attribute our company's annual budget to, or what was our annual expenditure attributable to? The one at the extreme bottom right, which is a tree map, that is something you will classically see when you see images of the GDPs of countries' economies. So you'll see that the largest box is, the largest sector of their economy. Towards the bottom left, you can see again composition graphs, but you're seeing them change. If you want to emphasize change over time, you will see those types. So if the stacked area charts that you see, one example of those is you see the contribution of different countries' annual economies over a period of time. So famous work done by Angus Madison. You can go and look it up, and you can see, how from the first, this work was done for the past 2,000 years. So you can see from the first century AD right up to almost the beginning of what in the West we call the Industrial Revolution, India had 25% or even more share of the world's GDP, and today it is somewhat recovered to, it's still less than 10%, still a meager amount. But from the 1800s onwards, it really decreased. So that's a different type of graphs. The ones on the right, they're classic distribution type of graphs. So histograms are some things which you'll see a lot in statistics. The ones at the top are also there. We talked about line charts, these circular, not exactly circular area charts, but similar. The wedge plots, which we saw Florence Nightingale tried to do. So they were great for cyclical data, going around with a calendar. So yeah, there's many things you need to consider, and there are good cheat sheets out like this out there, which you can go and read in detail. Many people have written lots of stuff about this. So there's plenty of resources available on the internet. Just Google this sort of stuff. What type of decisions do you want to make when you're making a data visualization? Think about the kinds of data or what kind of relationship you're trying to show. These were all static graphs, by the way. One other thing which we have not really mentioned, don't really go into in this session, but again, the distinction between static and dynamic graphs or dynamic visualizations. And that's the benefit of the internet or going beyond printed media. So on the left, you have a static map, which we in Jnana Prabodhini Foundation have created about the excess COVID-19 related deaths. So the size of the circle denotes the city, the population of the city, and these are just cities for which these estimates exist. And Pune did not have any. So we did it for the first time. So you can watch our webinar, go to our website for results about that. The right is something which you've probably seen, especially throughout the pandemic, but in other contexts as well. If you have geospatial data, you're seeing something change over time. So this is the number of detected COVID cases, positive COVID cases in the third wave, the Omicron wave in the Pune Municipal Corporation. So you can create dynamic visualizations like this, obviously, as well. But I think that's all we have time for in today's session. We'll give you these main takeaway messages, which again, shamelessly taken from Cedric Scherer, and will, as we mentioned, we'll be sharing his slides again. That understand your data and be accurate. That's the most important thing. You have to be rigorous about it. There's no compromise on quality. You cannot tell untrue things. Story, like be clear about the message of the visualization. Be clear about exactly what you want to convey with this. And then the goal, right? So if the story is sort of your big picture narrative, the goal, like you have to break that story down into particular chapters and graphs. So you might need to show many things. Like oftentimes you're not creating one graph in itself, you're creating a presentation, right? So you have to select multiple charts. So have a diversity of charts, show them, intersperse them with text or not text, and that goes to information in a logical coherent form. So these are some main high level takeaways of what you can do to improve your data visualization capacity. uh, Finally, we will also mention this thing, which I think was another good takeaway from Cedric Scherer's thing, is do we even need visualizations at all, right? So less is often more. So maybe something can just be conveyed in a sentence. Something can be conveyed in a few words. You don't even have to write something. So can you distill your message into something as simple as possible for your audience? That is the important goal that we all seek to do through this sort of data visualization. So we'll end with this quote by Hans Rosling, who is a great data visualizer. You can go and look up his maps, especially about GDP in different countries over time. He has created these famous bubble charts. But the quote by him is that most of us need to listen to music to understand how beautiful it is. But very often, that's just how we present statistics. We show the notes, we don't play the music. So that's what we need to do, right? Just like most people will not understand the music if you just show them the notes. They need to listen to it. Similarly, if you just present the numbers, the figures, boring data, people will not get it. You need to transform that data. You need to visualize it. You need to think of what story you're telling. Only then can you present your data in your statistics in a way that your audience will understand and will have a real world impact. Okay, that is all. Thank you for attending our education and outreach session by Jnana Prabodhini Foundation Analytics. We'll be back next time with another such session.